AWS Identity and Access Management, IAM, is one of the most critical and often most misunderstood services in AWS. Whether you're just starting your cloud journey or preparing for certifications, a solid understanding of IAM is essential for securing your AWS resources and avoiding costly mistakes. In this video, you'll get a clear introduction to AWS IAM, breaking down how authentication and authorization works, how policies are evaluated, and the distinction between IAM identities such as users, groups, and roles. We'll also walk through identity-based and resource-based policies, breaking down real policy statements so you can confidently read, write, and troubleshoot IAM permissions. So what is IAM? IAM stands for Identity and Access Management, and it's an AWS service that enables you to control access to AWS resources. Let's take the example where we have a user and an S3 bucket. The user has an image that it wishes to save to the S3 bucket. IAM is like a door providing security for the S3 bucket. If the user has permissions, then IAM will open the door and allow the user to save the image to the bucket. But if the user doesn't have the correct permissions, when the user tries to save the image to the S3 bucket, it will receive an error. So how exactly does IAM provide access to AWS services? Well, accessing AWS services involves two stages. The first is authentication, the second is authorization. Authentication. Authentication answers the question, who are you? So a user submits their sign-in credentials, and IAM checks whether these credentials are allowed to access AWS. This is the authentication process. Next, we have step 2, which is authorization. Authorization answers, are you allowed to do this? So authorization comes into play when a user wants to use an AWS service to do something. So in our previous example, we had a user that wants to save an image to an S3 bucket. So when the user wants to use a service to do something, a request is sent. And the service needs to determine whether that request should be authorized. To do this, the service will ask IAM to authorize the request. To determine whether the request should be authorized, IAM checks all the policies associated with the user. If the policies allow the request, IAM will notify the service that the request is authorized, and the service will carry out the request. So IAM policies determine whether a request to use an AWS service is allowed or denied. In our security door analogy, they act as the key that decides whether the door opens or stays locked. To help us understand how policies work, we can think of each policy as creating the following statement. A has permission to do B to C. Let's break down this statement to get a deeper understanding of IAM policies. The principal is identified as A in the phrase. It is the entity, service, or account that makes the request within AWS. In this introduction, we'll be covering two types of principals: IAM Identities and AWS Services. In IAM, identities are the entities authorized by the policy. Identities include IAM Users, IAM Groups, and IAM Roles. In the next few sections, we'll explore the different IAM identities. An IAM user is a set of credentials for people that interact with AWS resources over an indefinite time period or sessions. We can use an IAM user for people who log on to the AWS console, use the AWS CLI with access keys, and need persistent credentials. An IAM user group is a collection of IAM users. User groups let you specify permissions for multiple users, which can make it easier to manage permissions for those users. For example, you could have a user group called admins and give that user group typical administrator permissions. Any user in that group automatically has admin group permissions. Users can also belong to multiple groups. IAM roles are like an IAM user. However, instead of being uniquely associated with one person, an IAM role is assumable by anyone who needs it. Also, a role does not have standard long-term credentials, such as a password or access keys associated with it. Instead, when you assume a role, it provides you with temporary security credentials for your session. So let's dive deeper into IAM roles. The reason I've chosen theatre masks to represent IAM roles is because the relationship between a principal and an IAM role is similar to that of an actor playing a character in a movie. When an actor steps into character, it takes on the character's abilities in the fictional world and behaves as the character while on set. When filming is finished, the actor steps out of character and returns to being themselves. An IAM role works in the same way. A principal assumes the role and temporarily gets permissions defined by that role. So while using the role, it acts as if it is that role. And when the task is finished, the role is released and the principal returns to its original permissions. So the permissions belong to the role, not the principal. Just like the character's abilities belong to the role and not the actor. We also need to note that a principal can assume multiple roles, and a single role can be assumed by multiple principals. Returning back to our policy statement, the has permissions component of our policy statement represents the policy's effect condition. The effect determines whether the principal is authorized or not. This is by the effect condition stating allow or deny. By default, all requests made by a user are denied for principals other than the root account. For the default deny associated with a user's account by default to be overridden, an explicit allow in any permissions policy is needed. However, an explicit deny in any policy overrides any allows in any other policy. In our policy statement, to do B represents the action. An action is the activity the principal has permission to perform. For example, an action list all my buckets allows the principal to list all buckets owned by the parent account. And action IAM change password lets users change only their own passwords. And C in our policy statement refers to the resource. A resource is an entity that principals can work with in AWS. The principal can only perform actions on resources listed in the policy. And examples of resources are an EC2 instance or an S3 bucket. In our introduction, we'll be covering two types of IAM policies: identity-based policies and resource-based policies. Now, there are other types of policies, but if you have a firm understanding of these two policy types, then you'll have enough of a foundation to understand all the other policies, and you can find information about those in the IAM documentation. So identity-based policies. Identity-based policies are attached to an IAM identity such as a user, group, or role. They define the resources the identity can access and what actions it can perform. So here we have an example identity-based policy document. You can see that it has the effect allow, it has the action EC2 asterisk, and asterisk is referred to as a wildcard, which means all or any. So effectively, this policy allows the principal to perform any EC2 action. And the resource has an asterisk too, which allows the principal to perform any action on any available resource. one thing you will notice is that there's no principle in an identity-based policy document. And this is because the principle is implied by the fact that an identity-based policy document is attached to an identity. The second type of policy we're going to cover is a resource-based policy. Resource-based policies are attached to AWS resources, such as an S3 bucket. Here we have the effect element, which is allow. We have the action element, which allows all S3 actions, and then we have the resources that can be accessed under this policy. How this differs from an identity-based policy is that here we have a principal, and as you can see, the principal is in fact a service and not a user. It's the AWS EC2 service that is the principal within this policy.